Every moral theory promises a map d'arrêt. Aristotle's map has a route marked in detail, but no one can tell you where to start, and the destination moves. This video traces Aristotle's doctrine of the mean, the claim that virtue lies between extremes, that the good life is found not in excess or deficiency, but in precision. But the mean, it turns out, is never where you expect. Two questions will haunt what follows. First, if virtue is learned only through habit, how do you begin when you have none? Second, if happiness requires good fortune, health, wealth, freedom, is philosophy only for the lucky? We are drawn to extremes. The coward hides, the reckless man charges. Both feel certainty. The mean, courage, feels like hesitation, like weakness. Aristotle names this the doctrine of the mean. Every virtue, he says, stands between two vices, one of excess, one of deficiency, courage between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness, temperance between insensibility and indulgence, proper pride between vanity and servility, each virtue a knife edge. It sounds at first like a recipe for mediocrity. The moderate man, the one who never commits, who never goes too far, is that virtue or cowardice dressed in philosophy. But Aristotle insists the mean is not compromise. It is precision. The archer does not aim halfway between the target and the ground. He aims at the center. Miss by excess or deficiency, and the arrow fails. The target is small. The mean is not weak. It is the hardest point to hit. And it moves. What counts as courage for one man may be recklessness for another. What is generous in Athens may be wasteful in Sparta. The mean is relative to the person and the circumstance, which raises the question Aristotle never quite answers cleanly. How do you know where it is? If there is no formula, no rule that holds across cases, then what separates the mean from mere opinion? What keeps virtue from collapsing into relativism? Aristotle gives an answer, but it will not satisfy everyone. The mean is what the phronimos, the man of practical wisdom, would choose. Ask him. But who is the phronimos? And if I cannot recognize him, how does that help? The definition is circular. You need wisdom to identify the wise. Still, there is something here. Aristotle is saying, virtue is not a theorem. It is a trained perception. And perception cannot be taught in words alone. Consider Milo the wrestler. His trainer tells him to eat the mean amount of food, neither too much nor too little. What is that? For a child, 6 pounds of meat is excess. For Milo, it is starvation. The mean is not the arithmetic middle. It is the right amount for him now, given his work. So virtue requires knowledge of particulars. You must know yourself, the situation, the stakes, the history. Aristotle calls this phronesis, practical wisdom, the eye that sees what fits. But phronesis is not a formula you memorize. It is a kind of perception, acquired through experience, refined over years. You learn to see the mean the way a musician hears the right note. The virtuous man does not calculate the mean. He perceives it. The choice feels obvious to him, immediate, but only because he has spent a lifetime training his perception. The rest of us see fog. What looks like courage to me looks like recklessness to you. We argue past each other, and Aristotle offers no algorithm to settle it. He says, ask the phronimos. But we return to the circle. Who is he? If you cannot recognize wisdom, the answer does not help. And if you were not raised to recognize it, what then? This is where the first question sharpens. Aristotle assumes you were raised well, that someone, a father, a tutor, a city, taught you to see correctly. But what if they did not? What if your habits are already corrupt? What if the examples you saw were vicious, and you learned to call cruelty strength, and cowardice prudence? Can you choose the mean when your very sense of what is reasonable has been deformed? Aristotle does not say you cannot. He just does not tell you how. The question hangs, and so we turn to the structure of virtue itself. How exactly does one become virtuous? Aristotle's answer: by doing virtuous acts, repeatedly. But here, the circle tightens. To act virtuously, you must already know what virtue looks like. And if you lack that knowledge, where do you begin? Aristotle sees the trap. His answer: in the beginning, you imitate. You follow the man who acts well, not because you understand yet, but because he does. Aristotle is blunt on this point. Virtue is not innate. You are not born brave, temperate, or just. You become so by doing brave, temperate, and just acts. We become builders by building, lyre players by playing the lyre, the just by doing just things. Virtue, he writes, is hexis, a stable disposition carved into the soul by repetition. But here is the trap laid bare. To build well, you must already know what good building looks like. To act justly, you need some grasp of justice. The habit presupposes what it is meant to create. Aristotle acknowledges the problem. He says that at first you imitate blindly. You copy the virtuous man, not from understanding, but from trust. Over time, the repetition transforms you. What felt forced becomes natural. The mask you wear reshapes the face beneath. You act courageously, and eventually you are courageous. The habit becomes character. Except, who chooses the first mask? If your models are vicious, you rehearse vice as though it were virtue. The son of a tyrant learns cruelty as strength. The habit still forms. And once the habit sets, once the groove is carved deep, Aristotle admits it is nearly permanent. The vicious man cannot simply decide to change. His very desires have been trained wrong. So the first thread pulls tight. If virtue is learned through practice, and practice requires a good beginning, and a good beginning depends on luck, on being born to the right parents in the right city, then what? Aristotle never says anyone can be virtuous. He says the well-raised can, the well-situated can. The rest are not forbidden by law. They are locked out by history, by habit already set. Ask yourself, were you raised well? Do you recognize the phronimos when you see him? If the answer is no, does Aristotle have anything left to say to you? The silence is uncomfortable, and it prepares us for the second question. Because even if you were raised well, even if your habits are sound, Aristotle says, that is not enough. You also need help. Friends, a city that is not at war, some measure of wealth, external goods, he calls them. And here the ethics begins to look less like philosophy and more like privilege. The Stoics will later say that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. Epictetus, born a slave, will insist his chains cannot touch his inner freedom. Aristotle does not say this. He says, a man tortured on the rack, no matter how virtuous, is not living well. The slave, no matter how wise, cannot achieve eudaimonia, human flourishing. Aristotle is explicit. The body matters. This makes the ethics uncomfortable. It sounds less like universal wisdom and more like a handbook for aristocrats. The good life is for the healthy, the free, the moderately wealthy. What of the poor man who shares his last loaf of bread? Aristotle praises such acts, but he does not call that man fully happy. Something external is missing, and it shows. So the second thread tightens. If happiness requires goods you do not control, if it depends on not being crippled, enslaved, or starved, then philosophy cannot guarantee it. Fortune decides. and fortune is blind. The virtuous man can lose his children to plague, his health to accident, his city to war. Aristotle admits, such a man is no longer eudaimon. He endures, but he does not flourish. Compare this to the Stoic vision. Epictetus will say, my happiness does not depend on my leg, my freedom, or my station, only on my will. Only on what I can control. Aristotle cannot say that. For him, the body matters. The city matters. Your friends matter. Virtue is not a flame sealed inside a jar. It enacted in the world, and the world can extinguish it. So is this ethics or sociology? Is Aristotle mapping the good life? Or merely describing the life available to free Greek men of means? The question cuts deep. He knows the objection exists, but he does not apologize. Instead, in Book 10, he pivots. If the practical world is too fragile, too dependent on luck, perhaps the solution is to leave it. The highest life, Aristotle now says, is not the life of ethical virtue at all. It is the contemplative life, the life of the mind turned toward what does not change. The man who contemplates eternal truths, mathematics, metaphysics, the unmoved mover, lives closest to the divine, and he needs almost nothing external. Just time, just quiet. This life does not depend on fortune the way the ethical life does. It does not require political power or robust help. The thinker, lost in thought, is nearly invulnerable. But notice what this does to the edifice Aristotle just built. Courage, justice, generosity, the moral virtues are now second tier. Useful, perhaps, necessary for the city, but not the peak. The truly happy man is the one who transcends action altogether. He does not deliberate about means and ends. He does not navigate the mean. He thinks, and in thinking, he becomes godlike. So what was the point of the doctrine of the mean? If the peak of human life is to escape the realm where virtue applies, why spend 9 books mapping that realm in detail? One reading. Aristotle is being honest. The world of action is compromised, fragile, dependent on things breaking right. Virtue helps you navigate it, but it cannot save you from bad luck, bad cities, bad bodies. Contemplation is the escape hatch, the one form of happiness that does not require the stars to align. But it, too, is not for everyone. It requires education, leisure, freedom from labor. The slave does not have time to contemplate the unmoved mover. The laborer cannot retire to study geometry. The sick cannot concentrate through pain. Even here, fortune decides who enters. And so the ethics, whether practical or contemplative, collapses back into the same aristocratic enclosure. The good life in either form belongs to those who can afford it. What remains is not a universal ethics. It is a map drawn for the lucky few. Precise, yes. Rigorous, yes. But also narrow. And Aristotle knows it. He does not pretend otherwise. He does not write for the slave or the barbarian or the man born into chaos. He writes for the citizen, the son of a citizen, the inheritor. The Nicomachean Ethics is addressed to his son. It assumes a life already half blessed by fortune. It assumes the reader has something to lose. For those who have nothing, the doctrine of the mean is useless. For those who have everything, it is a guardrail. And for those in between, it is a reminder of how much they still need. And so we return to the 2 questions that opened this inquiry. First, if virtue is learned through habit, how do you begin when you have none? Aristotle's answer is imitation. But imitation requires the right model. And the right model requires fortune, the fortune of birth, of place, of upbringing. The circle closes without opening a door. The child of a vicious father will imitate vice. The man raised in a tyranny will mistake cruelty for justice. The habit still forms, but it locks him out of the good life. And Aristotle offers no key. Second, if happiness requires external goods, health, wealth, freedom, friends, then philosophy cannot secure it. Fortune still holds the final word. The Stoics will reject this. They will say virtue is sufficient. But Aristotle refuses that comfort. He knows the rack breaks men. He knows slavery diminishes the soul. He does not lie about it. What he offers instead is realism. The good life, as he maps it, is real. It is achievable, but it is not universal. It requires conditions most will never meet. And so the doctrine of the mean, for all its precision and insight, remains an ethics of exclusion. It draws a portrait of excellence, but it does not pretend the frame is wide enough for everyone. You can admire the portrait, you can study it, but whether you can step inside depends on where you were born, who raised you, and how the wheel turned. Aristotle does not apologize for this.